morning. This is week 4 of the flowering of the Middle Ages. Could we maybe show our sign on screen? Okay, I'll straighten it out. Week 4 on the flowering of the Middle Ages, and today is the day your first paper is due. Those of us in the studio class, we have collected the papers already, and so we're going to now enter into the second part of the class. The first part of the class was mainly introductory. We looked more at background than we looked than at the actual Middle Ages. Now, as we get into the second part of the class, we're going to actually look at the culture of the High Middle Ages, the actual medieval Renaissance. Okay, I wanted to start tonight by talking about some of the sources. I had a question last week. Are you the one who asked me the question about where I was getting the pictures and the maps? You were the one who asked me where I was getting the pictures and the maps. I brought you some books to show you where I'm getting them. And this book is a book by William Freeman, The Historical Geography of Europe, Volume 2. And this is the Historical Geography of Europe. You'll notice the publication date right down here at the bottom. If you could move to the bottom, or I'll move it. 1882. Okay, everything I'm showing you is copyright free, so that I'm not violating any laws by showing you the things I'm showing you. So these are some examples of the maps that are in here. Here is Greece and the Greek colonies. We haven't looked at that map, of course. We've looked at more European maps. Here is the Saracen domains. Now we call them the Muslim domains. Of course, this is 1882. But I got a lot of my maps out of this book, and I wanted to show you. I also get maps out of other books that are textbooks that are out of copyright. That I've gotten a lot of maps from those, and I'll show you some of those today. This is a major source of the books, of the pictures that I show you. This is The Arts in the Middle Ages by Paul Lacroix. And Paul Lacroix was a man who wrote in the 19th century, and he called himself Bibliophile Jacob. He actually worked at, I believe, the Museum of the Arsenal in Paris, and so he was really into manuscripts and looking at the different manuscripts. And he must have published, I don't know, 20 or 30 books that are filled with pictures and engravings. They're not photographs, but rather they're engravings that artists have gone in and looked at the real medieval manuscripts and have done engravings or drawings or pictures. And I'll try to find some for you. These are some drawings after the Bayeux Tapestry, which I'm going to use in the lecture tonight. And so you can see some scenes from the Bayeux Tapestry that the artist has drawn in here. And this book has hundreds of illustrations, and I happen to own 4 of Paul Lacroix's books. If you want to look at these books, they're in our library, but they're in special collections. You have to go up to the 8th floor to see them, because they're rather valuable books. Mine is falling apart, as you see. Here's a suit of armor, and here's a clock, a medieval clock, there are just all kinds of things. This is sculpture, various sculpture. So I have been mining books of this type to give you the illustrations that I've given you. Here is another example of the books I'm using. This is illuminated manuscripts. Oh, I forgot to tell you that The Arts in the Middle Ages was published in 1872. And most of Lacroix's books, here's how you spell his name, Paul Lacroix. Most of his books were published in the 1870s and 1880s. This book is by J.H. Middleton. It's called Illuminated Manuscripts in Classical and Medieval Time. And we've used a number of these in the lectures already. This is actually 4th century B.C., an example of Greek drawing. Here is an illuminated initial of the Celtic Carolingian type. And this has illustrations from manuscripts. I have about 4 books of this type, and so I use those as well. Okay, this, I didn't mean to bring 2 of Lacroix's books with me, but I did. Here is another book by Lacroix called Science and Literature in the Middle Ages, Science and Letters in the Middle Ages. And these are all the engravings. This is on the schools. Here's a crucifix. And here's a miniature of the City of God by St. Augustine when he talks about philosophy in here. So this is where I'm getting the illustrations that I'm showing you. And again, they are authentic in that they're very careful copies of the original manuscripts or original sculptures. Sometimes I'm going to show you photographs, sometimes I'm going to show you engravings. Everything, as I said, is out of copyright, so I'm legal. Okay, so I wanted to give you an idea of where I'm getting. Does that answer your question? Does that help you? Okay, I'm glad you asked that question because you know, I'm just showing you pictures out of the blue and you don't know where I got them. If I show you something that's not authentically medieval, I'll tell you. Okay, last time we looked at Anglo-Saxon women, England, and we looked at medieval women. We looked at the colonizing and growth of England up to the Viking invasions, and in fact we ended at about the Viking invasions. We looked at the roles of women in theory when we looked at the ideas, for example, of Eve and Mary as a kind of corrective for Eve. And the theories about women were usually quite negative, but at the end when Pador was talking about medieval women, she was talking in a very positive way about the enormous responsibility of women who had the job of looking after the manor while their husbands were engaged in politics or war or various state kinds of responsibilities, and the women ran the manor house. And later on I'm going to show you some manors, and they're very huge and extensive. It's like running a ranch, a modern ranch, because it's so big. They also are protector of the property, and Pador also mentioned that sometimes when the husbands were away on crusade or on business, the women put on armor and led the army to fight their enemies if they were attacked. She had the job of defending the castle or defending the manor. And so the women had a lot of responsibility, and the women had a lot of roles. We're going to sort of fill in around that today. We're going to talk mostly about men, but we're going to recreate the world in which these women functioned. Let me run through these women for a minute. If we could look at the pictures, we have, this is an early Christian woman, a saint, who would have been like Juliana, the play that we had. She would have looked something like this. Here are Carolingian women who Michael Moore mentioned might have looked like the daughters of Charlemagne. Here are some women of the 6th to the 10th century. Again, these could have been Merovingian or Carolingian women from the early Middle Ages. And here is a nun of the 11th century. She reminds me of someone like Hildegard of Bingen. She might have been an abbess or a nun in a monastery, and here she's presenting a manuscript to the Virgin. So she's in charge of the writing and the copying of the manuscripts in her abbey. Here are chambermaids with the babies. They might have been wet nurses. They are chambermaids of the 13th century. And here are women and men of the 14th century, and you can see their fashion is coming into being at this time. The fashions are changing, and I'm going to tell you today how the world of fashion began in Europe. Okay, and here are some more noble women with their children, and the children were treated largely like little adults, in fact, in this time, but the women are in charge of raising the children until they're 7. And here are women attending to the birth of a child and taking care of the baby as it's born. And here, of course, is the Virgin Mary, the Madonna, who is the model for all women. She is supposed to be the model of what women are like. Now, here are some men, and we're going to talk about men in the Middle Ages today and more about men. But before I begin, I'd like to check with the off-campus sites. I mailed a handout to all of you, and I want to see if you got it. How about you at University Center in the Woodlands? I can see you sitting there. Did you get the handout? Oh, she can't hear us.
No, there isn't anything.
Go into the office and check and see if they have an envelope there. I sent it on Wednesday. You certainly should have it by now. How about West Houston? Did you get the handout?
Yes, we did.
Good. Okay, something worked. Great. How about North Houston? Did you get the handout?
Yes, I have one here.
Good. All right. Fort Bend, are we connected with you? We may not be connected with Fort Bend. Oh, okay. I came in a day early and mailed them out early so you all would have the handout. The handout is the script for a play that's going to be performed in the second half of the class today. So you all here in the studio will get one. For you in the KUHT group who are watching this on TV, I have sent you all an email to tell you to find it on the website. How many people here in the studio found it, the script on the website? Good. All right. That's good. So it is on the website for you to follow the play because it's very hard to understand. You need the script in front of you. So we'll do that the second half. Okay, good. Now I'm doing the lecture the first half, so those of you off campus, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. We're having a live lecture tonight. So, okay. Tonight we're going to talk about Vikings, Normans, and Crusaders. And this is a huge topic. It's just enormous. But it fits together. There's something that links together the Vikings, the Normans, and the Crusaders. They're all warriors. They're explorers. They're conquerors and colonizers and state builders. And this is the business of the Vikings, Normans, and Crusaders. It's what they're all about. The Vikings, Normans, and Crusaders have to do with breaking out of the boundaries of Europe. It's a European frontier movement, whereas before Europeans are confined mostly to England and France and Italy, and of course the Muslims have conquered Spain, so European territory has actually been cut way down. And it is at the point around the year 1000 where the Europeans start breaking through their frontiers. And the frontiers we can identify are in Eastern Europe, Scandinavia, the North Atlantic, Spain, and the Eastern Mediterranean. And now let's turn to some of those frontiers. Here we see Europe at the time of Charlemagne, and although Charlemagne extended his empire pretty far out, here he conquered the Saxons here in this area, and he actually conquered Bavaria, and he got the Duke of Bavaria to do fealty to him, and he conquered the Avars here, who are a Hunnish people. And so Charlemagne started to push beyond those boundaries, but the yellow part in England is essentially Europe at the time of the year 1000. And so now the Vikings, paradoxically, the Vikings help break out of Europe, although it seems like they break into Europe. Yeah, they actually break out of Europe. Here is the extent of the Carolingian Empire at the time of the sort of breakdown of the Carolingian Empire in 980. The empire has broken up into little bitty pieces, and France is all broken into local governments. Here's the Kingdom of Burgundy, and in theory Germany is unified, but it's very tenuous at this time that the so-called Holy Roman Empire is unified. It isn't really, it just appears to be unified. And so this is the starting point that we'll look at. The parenthesis, have we mentioned the parenthesis before? We haven't, okay, good, I didn't think so. The parenthesis is very important. It's been altered by now, but it's a key starting point to look at what was happening to Europe. And the parenthesis, stated in a nutshell, is without Mohammed there would have been no Charlemagne. And in fact, what he says is that Islam cuts Europe off from the Mediterranean, and Europe is left high and dry. It must shift for itself, and the European center of gravity shifts northward. The new leaders are northern, whereas Italy and the Mediterranean had been the center of the Roman Empire and the center of early medieval Europe. Now it shifts northward. The new leaders are northern, and Charlemagne's capital is at Aachen, and I'll show you where Aachen is in a minute. I mentioned before that Charlemagne conquered the Saxons, and this put the Franks in touch with Denmark. In the wars among Charlemagne's grandsons, they hired the Danish Vikings as mercenaries to fight their battles for them. And here you can see on the map that this is the empire in 887, at the time when the grandsons of Charlemagne divided the Carolingian Empire among themselves. And this is the area of the Saxony, and you can see it's just south of Denmark. And actually the king of Denmark built a huge giant earthworks across the peninsula of Denmark to try to keep the Carolingians out. He looked at them as invaders. That's called the Danevirk. And so the Danes looked at the Carolingians as predators who were going to attack them. But on the other hand, when the grandsons of Charlemagne started their wars, what happened was that bands of mercenaries were hired, and they discovered that in Europe there were lots of huge monasteries that were utterly defenseless, nothing but monks in them, and full of gold and silver. And so in a way, the Carolingians brought the Viking raids on themselves, because they tempted the Vikings. The Vikings didn't know what was out there to get. And so this is one of the reasons the Viking raids begin, because they find out that in Europe the monasteries are easy pickings. But that's not the only thing that begins the Viking raids. The Vikings start trickling into Carolingian Europe in the 750s, and that's actually in the time of Charlemagne. And the Viking Age begins about 750, when they start impinging on Europe, when they develop their ship technology. The Viking Age ends in 1050. And so the Viking Age only lasts 300 years. In between, they went a Viking. And the correct pronunciation of the word Viking is, in fact, Viking. I pronounce it Viking because that's how we all say it now. But Viking is not a noun, it is a verb, and it means to go out raiding and trading. And the Vikings did not distinguish between raiding and trading. To them, raiding and trading were the same thing. The point was to get rich. And so any way you could get the wealth, you did it. If you faced a formidable enemy, if the city was well defended, or you had to fight somebody, they traded. They didn't fight, they traded. And if it was a defenseless monastery or a defenseless city, then they fought. They only fought when they knew they could win. And so that's one reason the Europeans thought they were so treacherous, because, you know, they weren't operating by the same rules as the Europeans. They had a different set of rules. The Viking ship technology was what allowed them to break out of Scandinavia. And before they broke out of Scandinavia, they shared a common culture. And they spoke the same language. It's called Old Norse. And there was no Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian, but everybody spoke Old Norse. And they shared the same religious systems. They had no real government in Scandinavia, in any of the Scandinavian countries. The government was purely local. And we don't have any kings in Scandinavia when the Viking Age begins. They're simply chieftains who are war leaders, who are leading bands of fighting men. And they may have their estates at home, their farms that their women take care of while they're out fighting, but there's no such thing as a state or a government. They're really only fighting bands. Did you have a question?
I'm forgetting the name right now, but didn't they have something that was called like a thing?
Yes, that developed later. Later, as they developed their government, I don't know the origins of the thing. That's a very interesting question. The thing is the legislature. And later in Iceland, they developed the first democracy in all of Europe. And the legislature is where representatives come from all over Iceland, and they meet once a year. And it is, in fact, a legislative body that makes laws and tries court cases. The thing developed in Norway as well, but it was localized. All government was localized in 750 at the beginning of the Viking Age. By the end of the Viking Age, in 1050, then you have kingdoms, and then you have the all-thing that governs the entire state. Yeah. So it's a development that takes place over 300 years. The Vikings, when they broke out of Scandinavia, they shared a common language, they shared a common religion, they shared a common culture, a social culture. They were a warrior society. And they were builders of towns and trading posts. Everywhere they went, they built trading posts. Really, they weren't real towns. They were more like trading posts where they set up a kind of almost a campsite that they could return to, a base camp that they could return to and carry on their trading as they set up a network of trade throughout the North Sea, and later on it expanded all over. They were also the discoverers of new lands. The Orkneys, the Shetland, and Faroe Islands were stepping stones across the Atlantic, and from those island stepping stones they reached Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland, where they founded new colonies. And on the mainland in continental Europe, they occupied Normandy, Brittany, and Frisia, and Russia. They were the originators of the Russian state. And in all of these places that were populated, such as Normandy, Brittany, Frisia, and Russia, they blended with the natives. In Iceland, Greenland, and not really in Vinland, they didn't really take hold in Vinland, but in Iceland and Greenland, you have a pure Scandinavian culture, uncorrupted by the French or the Germans or the Slavs in Russia or any others, so that you can get an idea of the pure Russian idea. Excuse me. Okay, here is a wonderful map. This is a great map that shows where the Vikings went, and you can see all the places they went. Here is their home base in Norway and Sweden and Denmark. That's the homeland where they shared the common culture. Across the North Atlantic, here are the stepping stones, the Orkney Islands, the Shetland Islands, the Faroe Islands, and then they go across to Iceland and across to Greenland. And from Greenland they go to North America, to Labrador and Newfoundland, and here is, and colonies here, actually Nova Scotia in this area. They actually founded colonies that didn't last forever, but they lasted for a while there. They went in the direction that their country faced. The Norwegians were the ones who went across the North Atlantic. The Norwegians also went to England and Ireland. The Swedes went across the Baltic Sea to Russia, and they settled the area of Russia, there was nothing there. The Slavic land was wilderness. I mean, it was full of dark and dangerous forests, and the Slavs were very primitive. They were very localized, and they didn't have a government or much of an organization. And it was the Rus, the Swedish Vikings, who actually founded the first cities in Scandinavia, Kiev and Novgorod. And they founded what became the Russian state in this area, not because there was anything there to get or to trade for, but because they were on their way to Constantinople down here, and so they were going on those trade routes, and their goal was Constantinople. And in fact, they attacked Constantinople numerous times, but the Byzantines were very well defended, and they held them off. So they set up a trade, and then they discovered the Muslims over here in this area, and when they discovered that the Muslims would pay a lot of money for slaves, they sort of connected their whole empire together by trading in slaves. So a lot of Irishmen actually ended up in Muslim countries as slaves. If we could see the map again, I'll show this other area where they went. When they settled on the mainland, Frisia was a big area where they attacked and they settled. Do you all know where Frisia is today? What are the countries in Frisia today? It's right there. What?
Like Belgium?
Yes.
The Netherlands?
The Netherlands. Belgium, Holland, the Netherlands, that's what is in Frisia today, or we can call them the Low Countries. In the Middle Ages, that was called Frisia or Flanders. Here in Normandy, a settlement also stuck. In Frisia, they sort of got driven out, and they came back, and it was all very nebulous about whether or not they stayed in Frisia. In Normandy, we know they stayed, and they developed a very distinctive culture called the Normans, which I'll talk about after the Vikings. Brittany is not marked on this map, but they actually did attack Brittany in the same way they attacked Frisia. They invaded Ireland, and they were the founders of the first cities in Ireland. There were no cities in Ireland before the Vikings came, and they set up cities such as Dublin and Limerick, and the first cities were Viking trading posts that later grew to be cities. And so the Norwegians and the Danes sort of slugged it out in Ireland as to who would get it. They did the same thing in Scotland with their base in the Orkneys. They attacked the Scots from the north, and around in these islands to the west of Scotland they had a lot of Viking settlements. The Scots pretty much held them off, not because they were stronger than the Vikings, but because there was nothing in Scotland. It was a wilderness. There was nothing to get there, so they weren't very interested in being there. Ireland was a little bit different because Ireland was a kind of stepping stone, and a lot of Irish monks had preceded the Vikings across the Atlantic. And, for example, when the Vikings got to Iceland, there were already monks there, Irish monks there. So the Irish were a little more interesting and useful to the Vikings and the Norsemen. So this is, you might notice one other thing on this map, that the author of this map has Norman Italy and Sicily marked as Viking territory. It's really the Normans conquered down there, and we'll see that a little later. But I mean, you can't consider them Vikings anymore when they're Normans. So that's a little misleading on this map. That's one of the dangers of using old books for our maps. Here's a Viking ship, and this is a remnant of them, and they were marvelous ships. They were very seaworthy. They could just glide across the Atlantic. They had sails, and they had a wonderful rudder that worked beautifully to steer the ship, and they could build these Viking ships as either huge ocean-going ships or huge trading vessels, or they could build them as small boats that could go up and down rivers. They were wonderfully built and very seaworthy. They had a kind of square sail on them, and I'll show you a ship in a moment that has that square sail on it. that they could use to go before the wind. They also could row it with oars, and usually at the tip of it would be a face or a carving of a monster to scare away the land spirits, and so that was part of their Viking adventure. Well, what were they like? They lived in the environment of the frozen north, and they were truly Northmen. They were completely attuned and adapted to their culture. We have a reading in our readings book of a Viking saga. That's Othin's story, translated by Carl Lindahl, which is a Viking saga, if you'd like to read that with the idea of the Viking nature of it in mind. Their religion was polytheistic. They couldn't have been any more foreign to Christian Europe than they were. They had three main gods: Odin, who was an irrational god of wisdom, but by wisdom they meant magic. Odin, in fact, hung on a tree for 9 days and gave up one of his eyes in order to get the secret of magic, and that's what they meant by wisdom, magic and casting spells and things of that sort. Odin was irrational. He did not operate by principles of reason. He could strike you dead as easily as look at you for no reason at all, and that's just the way he was. Thor, however, was a god of justice and war, and was often the god of the common man. He was a god of thunder and lightning, and he would strike his great hammer to make the thunder and lightning, and he was a good god for warriors. Odin was more of a god for the aristocrats who were the rulers. I guess they didn't need to be rational if they were rulers in their society. Frey and Freya were twin brothers and sisters who were fertility gods, and they were apparently gods and goddesses left over from a previous civilization that were more based on fertility and agriculture, and they were overtaken by the warrior society that worshipped Odin and Thor and absorbed into the culture. They had no theology as such, as you think of theology, but they had a mythology, and they had a set of myths that explained how the world operated. They had no written language, but they had symbols for words and letters, and these were runes. They had runes. They only used them to cast magic spells or to write a kind of incantation, and I think I'm going to show you a runestone. I'm going to show you some of the environment, and then I'll show you a runestone. This is actually in Iceland, and I've taken this map from a Viking saga that's copyright free, and you can see the environment that they live in with the fjords, and they live on the sea. They eat fish, and they hunt for animals that live in the frozen north. And this is kind of what the north country looks like. This is the Thorness thing with Helgafell in the distance. These are scenes of Iceland, and Iceland is like Norway. Iceland is an area where it's very snowy and cold and difficult to survive. Here's Laidholm. These are all watercolors that show the kind of majestic isolation of the typical Norwegian and Swedish and Icelandic country. And again, with the snow-covered mountains, and here's a little Viking settlement in the foreground. And here's Gullfoss. And here is some more of this territory. Here's Iceland. So you can get a feeling for the land of the midnight sun. Midfjord and Hruda Fjord. Okay, and here is a runestone, and this is actually this is the longest inscription that we have. it's the longest known Viking inscription, but the runes basically say things like Svein was here and landed on this spot, and this is where his wife died, or something like that. That's what the rune inscriptions might say, or they might be a magical incantation of luck. And so that they couldn't use the runes for literary purposes. Do you have a question?
But they still didn't consider that a written language?
Well, not exactly, no, because they didn't write anything with it. I mean, they wrote some inscriptions, but they didn't write literature, they didn't write history, they didn't write stories, they didn't write king lists. All of that came later, after they became Christian, that they wrote the sagas and all of those histories. Okay, so the runes, and here is a Swedish rock carving showing a man plowing. I'm sorry I couldn't find a whole lot of Viking art, but here is a rock carving, and here is some Norse metalwork. If we could look at this a minute. This Norse metalwork, and this, one of the things you might notice about the Norse metalwork, I mean, let me just ask you, what do you notice about this Norse metalwork? What do you see here? Maybe we could focus first on this one, if we could focus down on the top emblem. And what do you see here? Warriors. It's a warrior society, and they're riding horses and they're armed. What else do you see?
The bottom half looks a little what might be considered Celtic, especially on the bottom piece.
Oh, on the bottom piece? Yeah, we'll look at the bottom piece in a moment, but what do you see on the top piece? Okay. They're fighting beasties. They're fighting dragons and monsters and beasts of all kinds. Well, how are they dressed? What strikes you about their clothes? Pressure
Kind of an armor?
They're wearing armor. They're wearing the same kind of armor that the Europeans are wearing. They have those conical helmets that are actually just like the helmets that Charlemagne's people wear. So one of the things we can say about them is they're not very different from the Germans, which is quite interesting. They actually conquered England twice. And when they landed on the shores of England, the English could understand them. The English could understand their language. Why do you think that is? Any guesses? Yeah.
Didn't the Saxons also come from that region when they conquered England?
Exactly. The Angles and the Saxons came from Denmark and just below Denmark. They spoke Old Norse, and Anglo-Saxon is very close to Old Norse. And so the English are very closely related to the Vikings, and so that's one of the striking things. Let's get to the second of the medallions here, if you could focus on this. And someone off campus had a comment about this second picture. What do you think about it? Someone off campus, did you have a comment about this second picture? Oh,
I had mentioned that it looked Celtic.
It does. What looks Celtic about it?
The interlooping of the designs, the way it twists, and a lot of Celtic art looks very similar.
Absolutely. That's called interlace, and Celtic art has the same features in it. So the point is, all of these northern peoples are related to each other, and if you go back far enough, they all come from the same roots. And so there's something familiar to all of them about all the others. So this is quite like Celtic interlace. The Germans use interlace, and the Germans also do a lot of metalwork as well. And so these people are all related. Okay. Snorri Sturluson wrote the Edda. He actually wrote a prose Edda and a poetic Edda that tells the whole story of the Viking cosmology. They believe that the universe was created in the collision between ice and fire. And because of this great collision, it generated a race of giants, and and interestingly, from a cow licking a salt block, the first people were created called Ash and Embla, and the first men and women had the names of trees. You can recognize ash tree. I think Embla might be birch tree or something like that, but they have the names of tree. And Yggdrasil is the world ash tree. It's a huge tree that goes from heaven to hell, and in the middle of it is Midgard, where people live. The race of giants have their own land that Yggdrasil grows in, and the race of men have their own land, and the gods have their own land. There are additional gods. There are really hundreds of gods, and I've listed just a few of them here for you. Loki is the trickster, the master of deceit, and the shape changer who can take the form of any animal or person he wants to. Balder the Beautiful is Odin's son, and he is actually killed by an arrow. Loki is the one who engineers that. Balder was so beautiful that the gods granted him immunity from harm from all creatures except one little insignificant creature, the mistletoe. And Loki then got Balder's blind brother to shoot Balder the Beautiful with an arrow made out of mistletoe, the only thing that could kill him. And so Balder the Beautiful was killed, and later he was resurrected. And so there's a link with Christianity. You can see right there that Balder was the beautiful, perfect son of Odin. Valhalla was their heaven, and it was basically for warriors only. Only the warriors could go to heaven. And the Valkyries were maidens who were the ones who summoned the warriors to Valhalla on the battlefield. And it was Odin's banqueting hall. And so all night the warriors in Valhalla feast and drink and make merry, and then all day they fight each other on the field of battle. And that's their idea of heaven. All of this cosmology and world will come to an end in Ragnarok, the doom or destiny of the gods. And Ragnarok comes about because of a war between good and evil, and all the different gods and demons and monsters are involved in this war between good and evil, and good actually wins out in the battle, and the old order is destroyed and a new world order is created. Does that remind you of anything? Remind you of any other stories like that? Yeah.
Armageddon.
Well, it's like Armageddon. Yeah, if you go all the way back to the Indo-Europeans who were the Persians, who had contact with the Jews, that was later picked up by the Christians and incorporated into Christianity. It's an Indo-European feature. Another thing it might remind you of is Hindu mythology. The Hindus have, as part of their religion, theories of the world ending and coming to an end through destruction, and then a new order beginning, a fresh new world being created. So that's an Indo-European kind of religion. Okay, there are vague similarities to Christianity, but no exact parallels. And what in fact the Vikings did was to incorporate Christianity into their religion. Christ just became another one of their gods, and that's how most conversions take place anyway. And so they would carry around crosses and amulets in one pocket for Christ, and in the other pocket for Thor. And so they hedged their bets and kept all the gods. The conversions of the Vikings were complete by circa 1000, and the story of that is in the Chronicle of Adam of Bremen. And Bremen is in northern Germany, where you would expect, just on the border with Denmark. And that was the site of the Christian missionaries who were launched into Scandinavia. And all of that story is in Adam of Bremen. The missionaries come from Carolingian outposts in Germany. And one of the things that really influenced the conversion was the certain political advantages of Christianity. And one thing Christianity had going for it was a theory of kingship, where they believed that God ordained the king to rule over the country. The king was chosen by God and was therefore God's representative and had a kind of sanctity. And this appealed to the ambitious leaders of the Vikings, and what they did was organize their states. They started conquering states, and in fact, all the conversions of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway were forced by the kings. They forced Christianity on the people, and one of the reasons was because they liked that theory of kingship. They could become a powerful king, whereas in the beginning, there were no powerful kings. So the Scandinavians began their state building with the conversion to Christianity, or sort of interacting with the conversion of Christianity. The society of the Vikings had 3 classes, and the classes are described in the 10th century Rigsthula, which is a legend about the creation of the classes. And the 3 classes are the jarls, the leaders, and the nobilities, and basically that is a warrior class. And the leaders, the commanders. Does jarl remind you of anything? Can you think of a similar word to jarl? Yeah.
Earl.
Earl, exactly, yeah. In England, when the Vikings take over, they become earls, and that comes from the Viking Jarl. The Carls are yeomen farmers and are free men. They're also warriors, but they're a kind of class of free men. And the Thralls are slaves. Mostly the culture is agricultural. They live on small farms, and they fish, they hunt to supplement their income. And the fishing and hunting also gets them into seafaring and shipbuilding and raiding and trading. The technological inventions spurred the invasions, the Viking ships, and their mastery of navigation, which they mostly did from complete knowledge of the waves and the water and the sky and the sun and the stars, and they just knew it so thoroughly they could navigate by natural events. At least one historian thinks that the heavy plow was spread to Europe by the Vikings. We know that the heavy plow originated in the Slavic areas of Russia, and Archibald Lewis thinks that the Vikings brought the heavy plow to England and France, which allowed England and France to open up their forests and cultivate the land, as we've already seen. In Russia, they founded the cities of Kiev and Novgorod, which grew into eventually Russia. Ivar the Far Wanderer is a legendary character who supposedly went to Russia in 750. Rurik was the leader of the Rus, who, according to the calling of the Varangians, were actually asked by the Slavs to come and rule over them. When you hear a story like that, you should suspect that it's not true. But it's called the calling of the Varangians, where the Rus supposedly were brought in and because they were asked to bring some order to the society of the Slavs. Ireland was invaded for the first time around 795, and the Vikings conquered the Orkneys by 870. And in northern England, the first serious invasion came in 865, and that invasion, in fact, ended up in the complete conquest of England. In 876 to 9, there was the initial Danish settlement in England, and they actually colonized it. They were stopped temporarily by King Alfred the Great, and supposedly the Kingdom of England begins with Alfred, but if you sort of examine it more closely, it takes a while for Alfred and his children to incorporate the Vikings. Iceland was settled from 870 to 930, Greenland from 982, and Vinland around 1000. And all of these far places were discovered by outlaws who had been exiled from their countries, usually because they had committed murders. And so they were out sailing looking for a new place to live, and most of them were blown off course, and they discovered these countries, Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland, by accident because they were blown off course. And when they sailed back to find their way home, people could return by following the landmarks that they observed on their way home in order to get back to, for example, Vinland. You trace their path back. Iceland, as we already said, was Europe's first pure democracy, and the legislature met once a year. It's called the Althing. The law speaker presided, and the law speaker was elected for a 3-year term. And each year he would recite 1/3 of the law. And this, of course, is an oral culture. Before they had writing, that's why they had to recite the law, because they had no writing. The Godar are representatives to the yearly meetings, and the Godar, I forget the singular and plural, a Godi is a local aristocrat who is a man of wealth and power, who has a lot of dependents under him, who are like vassals in a way. And all the Godar come together and they represent all their men at the legislature at the yearly meeting. And a lot of the business that's done at the yearly meeting is judging crimes at court. So they're a very legalistic society. Iceland itself was divided into 4 quarters, and you can remember the names of them very easily because they're called north, east, south, and west. And so it's divided exactly into 4 quarters, and each of the quarters has its own local thing that meets also once a year. Iceland was the only country that I know of that voted to convert to Christianity in the year 1000, and they voted to convert to Christianity because they wanted the bishops and the missionaries there to bring them the art of reading and writing. They knew the value of it. However, at the same time, they passed a law that the ancient Norse religion could be practiced in private by anybody who wanted to. So in name, they were Christians. In reality, they could be anything they wanted to. So a complete democracy. Here is Alfred's jewel, which represents Alfred the Great as the one who stopped the Viking incursion into England. And here we see again the discoveries of the Norsemen, the areas that they colonized. And this map is a little better because it shows you the areas of the New World that are actually named in the Vinland sagas as to where they settled. Leif Erikson was the one who settled in the New World. He had a colony of houses that he built there, and he knew where it was because at least 4 expeditions went back there and settled in the houses and lived in them for a certain amount of time. They brought livestock, and they brought their women there with them. In essence, the countries, the colonies in the New World didn't succeed because they were just outnumbered by the Aborigines. I mean, the American Indians were technologically on the same level with them, and they just outnumbered them enormously, and so they were driven out just by sheer numbers. One of the things that's often said about the Vikings is that they didn't endure anywhere they went. They disappeared. You know, in Russia they disappeared, in Normandy they disappeared, in England they disappeared. They lost their culture in the places that they settled, except Iceland, of course, and Greenland. But yeah, is there a question?
You were talking about the monks going across the Atlantic. How far across the Atlantic did they make it?
We know that the monks got to Iceland. We know they got that far. They got to these islands. They got to the Orkney Islands. They got to the Faroe Islands. I think the Faroes are here, and the Shetlands are here, and the Faroes are here. And they got to Iceland. I don't know if they got to Greenland. There's at least one saga called the Voyage of St. Brendan that says they got to the New World. But there's no other evidence that they got to the New World.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So one of the things they did was conquer England, as I said, twice. And we might notice on this map this area called the Danelaw, and maybe you could focus down into that. the colonies that are now going to become important are Normandy down here and the Danelaw here. This area is called the Danelaw because it was ruled by Danish law and not by English law. Alfred allowed them to live by their own law, and so I mean this is an Anglo-Scandinavian country. You can't call it anything else. It's an Anglo-Scandinavian country in England, and long after Alfred was dead, it was conquered a second time by Svein Forkbeard, and Svein promptly died, and then his son Canute took over in 1016. Canute ruled arguably the first unified English kingdom, and he married Emma of Normandy, who had previously been married to King Ethelred, and her children by King Ethelred were sent to Normandy. And Canute ruled Norway, part of Sweden, Denmark, and England, the center of a Norse Sea empire. In England, the Danes altered the government so that the old Anglo-Saxony aldermen became earls, and the Godwin family in particular, as Patricia knows, Patricia's working on the Godwins, and the Godwin family in particular took over all of England. I tend to think of Edward the Confessor, who is one of those children of Emma and Ethelred, raised in Normandy, was a kind of puppet king controlled by the Godwins, but I think Patricia disagrees with me. Okay, that's interesting. Edward the Confessor, in fact, married Edith, the daughter of Earl Godwin, and when Edward the Confessor died, Harold Godwinson seizes the throne, and this sets the scene for the Norman conquest of England. And here is England at the time of the Norman conquest, and we can see the great earldoms here. Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria are the great earldoms, and they are all controlled by Godwin relatives at the time of the Norman conquest. And of course Harold controls everything when he takes over. Here is the North Sea Empire that Canute ruled. Here he's ruling all of England. He's got Norway, he's got part of Sweden, he's got Denmark. It looks like England is pointed in that direction before the Norman conquest. The Normans were also Vikings. They were Viking settlers in northern France, and in 911 at the Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte, Rollo, a Viking whose Viking name was Hrolf the Ganger, and that means Hrolf the Ganger because his legs gangled on his horse and dragged on the ground. He was so tall, and so Gangler means walker. So Hrolf the Ganger, it was Rollo. He was actually made a vassal of King Charles the Simple and was given Normandy. Eleanor Searle's book, Predatory Kinship, outlines a theory of intermarriage and kinship relations that built the power of the Normans. The Vikings who settled in Normandy, she believes that they weren't converted for about 100 years. It took them a long time, and they sort of held on by the skin of their teeth. But eventually they converted to Christianity, and they adopted French feudalism, which was a kind of system of political organization on the local level. And it originated during the breakdown of the Carolingian Empire. What it was characterized by was castles, which are little fortresses. Castle means little fort. Vassals and lords. Vassals, of course, are dependents of lords, and fiefs are lands granted out to the vassals by the lords. The vassals swear an oath of homage and fealty to their lord, and this is the system adopted by the Normans. The Normans also played political games. Duke Richard I of Normandy married his daughter Emma to Ethelred, and this is Emma of Normandy, who we talked about, who married first Ethelred and then Canute. And the children of Emma and Ethelred were raised at the ducal court in Normandy at the time of William the Conqueror. In 1035, Duke Robert the Magnificent died, and his son, William the Bastard, inherited Normandy at the age of 7. He spent the next, how many years, 15 or so years, 20 years, taming the Norman barons, because Normandy exploded into rebellion the minute that Robert the Magnificent died. And in fact, William's guardian had to spirit him out in the middle of the night in order to save his life. So it was really quite dangerous. And William grew up in the midst of danger and had to fight for his life. And this is one reason that he was such a strong and effective conqueror. Here is a scene from the Bayeux Tapestry that tells about the conquest of England. It's a tapestry that tells the conquest of England. And here is Duke William in the midst of the Norman conquest, raising his helmet to say, "No, I'm not dead. Here I am. I'm leading the battle." And that's one of the turning points. Here are the castles that are the hallmark of feudalism. Here is the keep that is the original castle. The original castles were made out of wood, and later they were made out of stone when the Normans went to England. Here is a famous castle, Chateau Gaillard, in France, which is the kind of castle that was eventually built in the feudal system. And here is a plan of that castle system, so you can see how complex it is and how complicated it is. The tower is here, and then it's surrounded by a wall here, and then by another wall here, and you can see it's at the top of a hill that commands the whole countryside. And that's what a castle is like. Here is the Norman castle at Rouen that William the Conqueror began building and his son Henry I finished. And here is the medieval city of Rouen in the Middle Ages. This is what the city would have looked like with its churches in the middle. And here is the kind of Norman manor that the Normans had in Normandy, with their manor house and their lands and the appurtenances to it, which they later had in England as well. And here is the seaside quay at Rouen. Okay, and here are some old houses in Rouen that are actually still standing today. You can see what the Norman houses look like. They're very interesting medieval houses. And here are the Norman lords enjoying themselves with falconry. The Battle of Hastings was in 1066, and this, of course, is the Norman conquest. When the Normans conquered England, they began a huge building campaign, building churches and castles all over England. One of the greatest achievements of William the Conqueror was the writing of Domesday Book in 1086. And this was a great survey taken in England where the sheriffs went out and they counted everything. They counted all the cows and chickens and pigs and watermills and plows and people on the land, and did a survey, a very accurate survey of all of England. And John Lienhart mentioned that there were over 5,000 watermills in England counted in that survey. Archbishop Lanfranc reformed the English church and set the pattern that the English church would follow ever after. At the death of William the Conqueror, his oldest son, Duke Robert Curthose, inherited Normandy, and his second son, William II Rufus, inherited England. William Rufus has the reputation of being the worst king that England ever had, and he died in an accident scarcely 13 years later in 1100. During his reign, the investiture contest was hammered out between the king and Archbishop Anselm, who was following Lanfranc's example. When Rufus died, the third son of the conqueror, Henry I, became King of England. He was the Lion of Justice, the inventor of the Exchequer. And the Exchequer is, of course, the treasury of England. It's called the Exchequer because the money was counted on a checkered cloth with counters like an abacus, and that's why it's called the exchequer. Here are the Normans in Normandy building their boats. They're chopping down trees and building the boats to carry out the Norman conquest. Here is the ship with a square sail that they built to sail across the channel. And notice how Viking it is. Look at here, the little dragon head on the prow to guard against the spirits. And so you wonder how Christian the Normans were. Here are the Normans fighting, and they're called the Franki. Notice that in the Bayeux Tapestry, the Franki are fighting. And the Normans are called the Franki because, I don't know why, because they're Franks. Here's a Norman archer, and here is a Norman lancer in William's army. And this is King William as represented on his seal. That's a drawing of him. Here are the Normans actually fighting the Battle of Hastings. These are the Normans here riding on horseback, and here are the Anglo-Saxons who fought on their feet. They fought standing, dismounted in a shield wall. It's one of the most famous battles in history, and a very unusual one because it lasted 9 hours. Here is England and Normandy as unified by William the Conqueror, and this is called the Anglo-Norman state, this territory that William the Conqueror ruled. This is a plan of a manor. When William the Conqueror granted out his lands in Normandy, he granted them out piecemeal. Wherever he went, he granted them to whoever was with them. And this was a very shrewd thing to do because nobody had a territory. All of the Norman barons held their land in scattered places all over England, so nobody could mount a rebellion against William the Conqueror. That was very smart of him to do that. They would build manor houses like this on all of their manors, and here is the great hall of an English manor house or a castle. It's the great hall, which makes you think of, I mean, it looks like it has the same features as a church, doesn't it? Yeah, and so manor houses were built all over England. Here are, Henry I ruled for 35 years when there was complete peace in England and the people enjoyed themselves. Here is a joust. Henry I was considered one of their great kings. Here are some of the buildings that the Normans built. Here is the west front of, I think this is Wells Cathedral. No, it's not Wells. I'm sorry, I've forgotten which cathedral this is. But it's a Norman cathedral. And here is typical Norman architecture. This is the nave of Durham Cathedral. And this is typically Norman. This decoration on the very thick pillars is Norman. These kind of dog-tooth decoration on the arches, these round Romanesque arches, all of that is typically Norman, especially these very heavy geometrically designed columns. And here's some more of Durham Cathedral where you can see that. Durham Cathedral is interesting because it's the first cathedral in France that has a groined vault in the ceiling. It's the first one that appears, the earliest one that appears. But we don't know who invented it. And here is the floor plan of Durham Cathedral. And this is typically English, whereas the French, here the Galilee porch and the French cathedrals have a round top at the top. This one is straight, and that's more typical of English cathedrals. This is the Norman stairway of Canterbury Cathedral, and again you can see those very typical Norman features. And this is the Galilee Chapel of Durham Cathedral, which shows again this very Norman dog-tooth decoration. And here is a view of the typical elevation inside the cathedral. And here's the bishop's throne. What is that called again? Remember what John McNamara said? Yeah, what is it called?
It's called a cathedra.
The cathedra, yes. This is the cathedra. That's why it's called a cathedral, because the bishop's throne is in there. That's the bishop's throne. Here is the Tower of London, which was the first castle built in England. It's still standing, and this chapel is inside the Tower of London. This is called William the Conqueror's Chapel, and it's in original condition. Here are some more castles. This is Colchester Castle, and this is Rochester Castle. If you're going to England, Rochester Castle is the best one to see. It's more like the original Norman castles, and here is Rochester Castle in the background of this picture, as seen from the river. Here is the patriarchal chair at Canterbury that the Archbishop would have been seated on, and here is another Archbishop of Canterbury. This is St. Edmund, who is following the tradition of Lanfranc and Anselm when running the church. This is a passage from Doomsday Book, which I mentioned before, the counting everything, and you can see he's adding up everything that's on the land. You have in your readings book a whole page from Doomsday Book, which again is this counting up of all the lands. These are all the king's vassals, and this is Terra Regis, the land of the king, that he's starting to enumerate within that county. And here is the council of... Pardon?
Do you know what page that counting's on in the book?
Yes, it's page 114 in the book.
Thank you.
Okay. And here is the Council of London, which, of course, church councils were something that Lanfranc and Anselm started in England and really stressed. In 1135 to 1154, King Stephen and the Empress Matilda engaged in a civil war. What happened was Henry I died after his son died. His only son was killed, and so he left the kingdom to his daughter Matilda. His nephew Stephen grabbed the throne, and Stephen's reign is routinely called the Anarchy of Stephen's reign. The Empress Matilda claimed the throne. She married Geoffrey of Anjou, and the family thereafter is called the Angevins. Stephen was succeeded by Matilda's son, Henry II, who is called the father of English common law. And one of his innovations was writs and assizes, standardized writs that you could go and purchase from the king and fill in the blanks, so that he brought order and logic to the legal system. In 1888 to 1889, Richard Lionheart made history by going on crusade, and England ran all by itself. It was so efficiently organized that even though Richard was gone most of his reign, the country survived nicely. He was succeeded by his brother in 1189, Bad King John, who lost Normandy to the French, and the barons rebelled and, of course, wrote Magna Carta. This is what one of these charters would have looked like. This is William's charter to London. And this is the marriage of King Henry II to Eleanor of Aquitaine. Okay. And here are the dominions of Henry II. Here is Aquitaine. He married Eleanor, and therefore he had more of France than the French king did. I showed you this area that the French king had before, so that he had most of France. Here is King John granting Magna Carta. This, of course, is a fictionalized reconstruction of King John, and this is an actual excerpt from Magna Carta, a photograph of that manuscript. I've put some sections of Magna Carta, I put the whole thing of Magna Carta in your readings book so that you have it there that you can read. And I don't remember what page it's on, but it's in the index. The Norman settlement and conquest of Italy and Sicily, which I have 1.5 minutes to get through. In 1002 to 1016, the Normans started infiltrating southern Italy, and they didn't conquer it all in one blow like the Normans conquered England. They infiltrated it, and it was led by the 12 sons of Tancred d'Hauteville. In 1059, Robert Guiscard, one of these sons, and his nephew Roger ally with the papacy, and they are just basically highway robbers. They make a treaty with the Pope, and the Pope grants them the right to conquer Italy and Sicily. So they sort of make a bargain with the Pope. And let me show you the Norman lands in Italy and Sicily. Okay, I'll have a few minutes at the beginning of the next lecture. I might try to at least show you a picture of the Crusades. But here are the Norman lands that they conquered. And Robert Guiscard was the ringleader of all of this. He ended up being Count of Apulia, and his nephew Roger conquered Sicily and became Count of Sicily. And he ends up taking over all the ruling of the church by making another treaty with the Pope. The Normans were great politicians. And the kings of Italy and Sicily ruled like Byzantine potentates. They absorbed the Byzantine and Muslim culture of that area. Okay, let's take a little bit of a break right now. Do we have our picture of the king here? Let's take a little break and be back in 15 minutes. Okay.